The final straw came when Wallace refused Truman's request to remain silent on foreign policy matters. The president had hoped for a compromise where Wallace could stay in the cabinet while ceasing his public criticism. But Wallace rejected this arrangement as a betrayal of his principles. According to accounts preserved in the Truman Presidential Library, the president told advisers that keeping Wallace was impossible and that the Commerce Secretary had become a national danger. Wallace's dismissal sent shockwaves through progressive circles. Labor unions, civil rights organizations, and peace activists who had viewed Wallace as their voice within the administration felt betrayed. Thousands of letters and telegrams flooded the White House, protesting what they saw as the silencing of dissent and the abandonment of Roosevelt's vision. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, one of the nation's most powerful labor federations, passed a resolution condemning Wallace's removal. Conservative and moderate Democrats, however, celebrated. Senator Tom Connally of Texas, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, declared that Wallace's departure removed a source of confusion and embarrassment to American foreign policy. The Washington establishment closed ranks around Truman, praising his decision as necessary for national security. Editorial pages of major newspapers, with few exceptions, supported the firing, arguing that cabinet unity on foreign policy was essential during such a dangerous period. For Wallace himself, the dismissal was both devastating and liberating. He had lost his platform within government, his access to classified information, and his ability to influence policy from the inside. But he had gained something else: freedom to speak without restraint, without the constraints of cabinet collective responsibility. Within weeks, Wallace would accept the editorship of the New Republic magazine, giving him a prominent progressive platform from which to wage his campaign against Cold War policies. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's firing revealed how thoroughly the political landscape had shifted since Roosevelt's death. The Democratic Party that had embraced Wallace's progressive vision in 1940 was now actively purging those ideas from positions of power. Truman was consolidating a new Democratic coalition built around anti-communism, military strength, and a more conservative domestic agenda. Wallace represented the road not taken, the alternative future that might have been if Roosevelt had lived or if Wallace had remained vice president. What neither Truman nor Wallace fully understood in September of 1946 was that this firing was not an ending but a beginning. Wallace would not fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, he would launch the most serious left-wing challenge to the Democratic Party in the 20th century, a campaign that would further expose the ideological fault lines in American politics and ultimately doom any realistic chance of avoiding the Cold War. December 30th, 1947, Henry Wallace announced his candidacy for President of the United States on a third-party ticket, directly challenging Harry Truman and the Democratic establishment. 15 months after his firing, Wallace had become the leader of a growing progressive movement that rejected both major parties' embrace of Cold War confrontation. His decision to run would prove to be one of the most consequential and controversial political moves of the era, fundamentally reshaping American politics for generations to come. The Progressive Party, as Wallace's movement called itself, represented a coalition of labor activists, civil rights advocates, pacifists, and those Americans who still believed in Roosevelt's vision of big power cooperation. The party platform called for ending military draft, nationalizing key industries, establishing comprehensive civil rights protections for African Americans, and pursuing immediate peace negotiations with the Soviet Union. It was the most left-wing major campaign platform in American history, and establishment figures on both left and right viewed it with alarm. Wallace's campaign rallies drew enormous crowds in major cities, particularly in New York, California, and the industrial Midwest. Thousands came to hear him denounce what he called Truman's bipartisan reactionary war policy. His speeches painted a dark picture of America, moving toward militarism, with billions of dollars diverted from social programs to military spending while civil rights remained an unfulfilled promise. "We are not afraid of communism," Wallace declared at one rally. "We are afraid of hunger and poverty and war." But from the beginning, Wallace's campaign was plagued by the issue that would ultimately destroy it: communist support and infiltration. The Communist Party USA enthusiastically backed Wallace's candidacy, seeing his opposition to Cold War policies as aligned with Soviet interests. While Wallace insisted his campaign was independent and non-communist, he refused to reject communist support, arguing that all Americans, regardless of political belief, had the right to participate in democratic politics. This position proved politically catastrophic. Anti-communist liberals, including prominent New Dealers like Eleanor Roosevelt, condemned Wallace's acceptance of communist backing. According to historical analyses documented in academic studies of the period, the Americans for Democratic Action, a liberal organization founded in early 1947, specifically positioned itself as a progressive alternative that excluded communists. Former Wallace allies, including labor leaders like Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, broke with him over the communist issue. The question of communist influence in Wallace's campaign was not entirely unfair. Evidence that emerged decades later from Soviet archives revealed that the Communist Party USA, which took direction from Moscow, had indeed played a significant role in organizing Wallace's campaign infrastructure. While Wallace himself was not a communist and genuinely believed in his principles, he was surrounded by advisors who saw his candidacy primarily as a vehicle for Soviet foreign policy objectives. Wallace's civil rights advocacy, which should have been his strongest asset, also proved complicated. His campaign was genuinely integrated at a time when both major parties maintained segregated operations in southern states. Wallace and his running mate, Senator Glenn Taylor of Idaho, faced arrests and violence when they defied segregation laws during Southern campaign swings. This courage was real and admirable, yet it too became tainted by charges that communists were exploiting racial tensions for political purposes. The Democratic establishment launched a sophisticated campaign to destroy Wallace's candidacy. Truman, recognizing the danger Wallace posed to his own re-election chances, moved leftward on domestic policy, proposing civil rights legislation and expanding New Deal programs. This political maneuvering was designed to blunt Wallace's appeal among traditional Democratic constituencies without compromising on anti-communist foreign policy. It worked. By mid-1948, Wallace's campaign was clearly faltering. Unions were withdrawing support, prominent progressives were distancing themselves, and polls showed his support collapsing. But Wallace pressed forward, believing that even in defeat, his campaign could demonstrate that alternatives to Cold War militarism existed. He could not have known that his third-party run would contribute to Truman's near defeat and would be used for decades as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging the Democratic establishment from the left. November 2nd, 1948, the presidential election results delivered a devastating verdict on Henry Wallace's political vision. He received just over 1 million votes nationwide, barely 2% of the total, finishing a distant fourth behind winner Harry Truman, Republican Thomas Dewey, and segregationist Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond. The Progressive Party failed to win a single electoral vote. Wallace, who had once been a heartbeat away from the presidency, had been thoroughly repudiated by American voters. The election results were particularly painful in their geographic distribution. Wallace had hoped to demonstrate strength in industrial states with strong labor movements, but unions had largely abandoned him. He received his highest vote totals in New York, where he garnered over 500,000 votes, but this was still only 8% of the state's total. Even in his home state of Iowa, where he had once been a beloved agricultural secretary, Wallace managed only 12,000 votes. The American people had rejected not just Wallace personally, but the entire progressive vision he represented. Truman's victory, one of the greatest upsets in American political history, came partly at Wallace's expense. The president had successfully reclaimed progressive voters by moving left on domestic policy while maintaining his hard line against Soviet expansion. Truman's whistle-stop campaign had portrayed Wallace as a dangerous radical whose naivete about communism threatened national security. The strategy worked brilliantly, isolating Wallace as too extreme for mainstream liberalism while simultaneously attacking Republicans as heartless reactionaries. The Progressive Party's poor showing had immediate and brutal consequences for those associated with it. In the emerging McCarthy era, Wallace supporters found themselves blacklisted from government jobs. Investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee and branded as communist sympathizers. Academic positions were lost, careers destroyed, families torn apart by loyalty investigations. The price for challenging Cold War orthodoxy was becoming clear, and it was steep. Wallace himself retreated from public life, returning to his farm in South Salem, New York. The man who had once been one of America's most powerful political figures now spent his days experimenting with agricultural techniques and writing occasional articles. He watched with horror as Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade accelerated, seeing in it the fulfillment of his warnings about militarism and paranoia. Yet Wallace's own role in discrediting progressivism by accepting communist support had inadvertently contributed to the very climate that made McCarthyism possible. The long-term impact of Wallace's campaign on American politics cannot be overstated. His defeat effectively ended serious left-wing opposition within the Democratic Party for a generation. Future progressives learned that challenging the party establishment from the left was political suicide. The lesson reinforced by Wallace's failure would echo through decades, constraining democratic politics within a narrow ideological band that accepted anti-communism and American global military dominance as non-negotiable principles. By the early 1950s, Wallace had largely recanted his earlier positions on Soviet cooperation. The Korean War, Stalin's brutal repression in Eastern Europe, and revelations about Soviet espionage in the American government convinced Wallace that he had been wrong about the possibility of accommodation. In a painful public statement, he acknowledged that the Soviet Union is utterly different from what I believed it to be. This recantation was perhaps more devastating than his election defeat, representing the final collapse of his worldview. Yet Wallace never fully renounced his vision of what America could have been. In his remaining years, he would live until November of 1965. He continued to advocate for arms control, economic development, and racial equality. He watched the emerging civil rights movement with satisfaction, believing it vindicated his earlier advocacy. He opposed the Vietnam War, seeing in it the fulfillment of his prophecy that militarism would corrupt American democracy. The historical judgment on Wallace remains deeply contested. Was he a prophetic voice warning against the dangers of militarism and Cold War paranoia? Or was he a naive dupe whose political blindness about Soviet intentions nearly undermined American security at a critical moment? The answer, like most historical truths, likely contains elements of both interpretations. January 12, 1950, barely 14 months after his electoral defeat, Henry Wallace watched as President Truman announced a massive military buildup and the development of the hydrogen bomb. From his farm in New York, the former vice president saw his worst fears materializing. The arms race he had warned against was accelerating, the military-industrial complex he had identified was growing more powerful, and the chance for peaceful accommodation with the Soviet Union was evaporating. History was vindicating his warnings even as it consigned his political career to failure. The National Security Council had just completed NSC-68. A secret document that would define American Cold War strategy for decades. Though Wallace could not know its specific contents, the policy shift was unmistakable. Defense spending would triple over the next several years. Permanent military alliances would extend American commitments across the globe, and covert operations would become routine instruments of foreign policy. The national security state Wallace had warned about was being constructed with bipartisan support and public enthusiasm. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, seemed to prove Wallace both right and catastrophically wrong. He had warned that militaristic policies would lead to conflict, and here was conflict on a massive scale. Yet the war also seemed to validate everything Truman had said about Soviet-backed aggression and the need for military strength. When North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet weapons and supported by Soviet advisors, poured across the 38th parallel, it appeared to confirm the domino theory that Wallace had dismissed as paranoid fantasy. Wallace's personal isolation deepened as friends and former allies scrambled to distance themselves from any association with him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained an extensive file on his activities, monitoring his correspondence and public statements for evidence of continued communist sympathies. Though Wallace had never been a communist, his politics were those of a Roosevelt New Dealer who believed in American capitalism reformed through democratic socialism. The distinction mattered little in the fevered atmosphere of early 1950s America. The Progressive Party that had nominated Wallace essentially collapsed after the election. Some of its members drifted back into the Democratic Party, accepting defeat and the new Cold War consensus. Others were driven from public life entirely, their careers destroyed by blacklists and loyalty investigations. A few maintained their dissent, continuing to argue for peace and disarmament through small publications and marginal organizations that were heavily infiltrated by FBI informants. Yet even as Wallace's political vision was being repudiated, some of his specific warnings proved accurate. The military spending he had opposed did lead to the neglect of domestic programs. The arms race he had predicted did spiral into mutual assured destruction and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The intervention in developing countries he had warned against did create exactly the pattern of blowback and resentment he had anticipated. His policy prescriptions may have been naive, but his diagnosis of where American militarism would lead was often correct. Wallace spent these years writing and farming, developing hybrid corn varieties and experimenting with agricultural techniques. His scientific work, which had always been his first passion, provided solace from political defeat. He corresponded with agricultural researchers worldwide, including some in the Soviet Union, maintaining the international scientific cooperation he had always advocated even as political relations between nations deteriorated. The cruelest irony of Wallace's political career was that he had been partially right about Soviet intentions while being completely wrong about Soviet methods. Stalin did want security for the Soviet Union after the devastation of World War II, but Stalin's methods for achieving that security, brutal repression, forced collectivization, systematic elimination of dissent were far more horrific than Wallace had imagined or acknowledged. Wallace's tragedy was that he had tried to find the reasonable position between two sides when one side was genuinely unreasonable, and in doing so, he had discredited the legitimate criticisms he had offered of American militarism. By 1953, when Stalin died, Wallace was largely forgotten by American politics. The vice presidency he had held seemed like ancient history, his presidential campaign a bizarre footnote to the Truman years. November 18, 1965, Henry Wallace died at the age of 77 in Danbury, Connecticut, having lived long enough to see the Vietnam War escalate into exactly the kind of military quagmire he had warned against. His obituaries were respectful but puzzled, struggling to make sense of a career that had taken him from the heights of power to political exile and partial rehabilitation. The man who might have been president instead became a cautionary tale, though what exactly the caution was supposed to be remained ambiguous. Looking back across the decades since Truman fired Wallace in 1946, several truths emerge from the historical fog. Wallace was right that the Cold War. April 12, 1945, the day Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, Henry Agard Wallace stood in his office at the Department of Commerce, staring at a telegram that would change American history. The vice president, who had served alongside FDR during the darkest years of World War II, was not in the room when Harry Truman took the oath of office. Wallace had been demoted, pushed aside, relegated to a cabinet position that felt more like exile than honor. But what few Americans knew then, and fewer understand now, was that the real battle for America's soul had only just begun. The story begins not with Roosevelt's death, but with the Democratic National Convention of 1944 in Chicago. According to historical accounts documented in the Roosevelt Presidential Library archives, party bosses had gathered in smoke-filled rooms with a singular mission: remove Henry Wallace from the ticket. The vice president had become too radical, too sympathetic to Soviet Russia, too dangerous for the post-war world they envisioned. Democratic Party Chairman Robert E. Hannigan led the charge, armed with a letter from Roosevelt himself, a letter whose authenticity Wallace would question until his dying day. Wallace represented something unprecedented in American politics. The Iowa farmer's son had transformed the Department of Agriculture during the Great Depression, pioneering programs that saved millions from starvation. When Roosevelt elevated him to vice president in 1940, Wallace became the voice of the common man, advocating for racial equality, workers' rights, and what he called the century of the common man. His speeches electrified crowds across America, promising a future where technology and democracy would lift humanity from poverty and oppression. But Wallace's idealism terrified the establishment. His vision of cooperation with the Soviet Union after the war clashed violently with emerging Cold War sentiment. Conservative Democrats, military leaders, and powerful industrialists saw Wallace as a threat to American capitalism itself. They whispered that he was naive, that Joseph Stalin was manipulating him, that his dreams of global cooperation were dangerous fantasies that would leave America vulnerable. The campaign to destroy Wallace's political career was methodical and ruthless. Party insiders spread rumors about his interest in mysticism and alternative spirituality, painting him as eccentric and unstable. They emphasized his friendship with Nicholas Roerich, a Russian mystic and artist, dredging up letters where Wallace had addressed Roerich with flowery, quasi-religious language. The Guru letters, as they became known, would haunt Wallace for years, weaponized by opponents to suggest he was unfit for high office. At the 1944 convention, despite overwhelming support from delegates on the convention floor, backroom dealing sealed Wallace's fate. Roosevelt, exhausted and dying, yielded to pressure from party bosses who insisted that Wallace could not win Southern states. The compromise candidate was Harry Truman, a relatively unknown senator from Missouri whose political views remained deliberately vague. Truman represented safety, mediocrity, the kind of man who would not rock the boat or challenge the established order. Wallace accepted his demotion with public grace, becoming Secretary of Commerce in Roosevelt's fourth term. He threw himself into planning for post-war reconstruction, developing ambitious programs for international development and cooperation. He believed that if America could help rebuild a devastated world, including the Soviet Union lasting, peace might finally be achievable. His 60 million jobs proposal promised to prevent another depression through massive public investment and global trade. Then came that April afternoon when everything changed. Roosevelt, the giant who had dominated American politics for over 12 years, was gone. The man sitting in the Oval Office was Harry Truman, a politician Wallace barely knew, surrounded by advisors who viewed Wallace's idealism with contempt and suspicion. The countdown to Wallace's political execution had begun, though he did not yet know it. The clash between Truman's emerging Cold War doctrine and Wallace's dream of peaceful coexistence would define the next critical months of American history. April 13, 1945, Harry Truman's first full day as president began with a confession of inadequacy. "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me," he later wrote. The former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, had been vice president for merely 82 days. Roosevelt had barely spoken to him, sharing none of the secret negotiations at Yalta, nothing about the atomic bomb project, nothing about the growing tensions with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Truman was thrust onto the world stage knowing less about America's strategic position than many cabinet secretaries, including Henry Wallace. Wallace attended Roosevelt's funeral with a heavy heart, not just mourning his fallen leader but sensing the shift in political winds. The Commerce Secretary still commanded significant support among labor unions, progressive organizations, and millions of Americans who had cheered his vision of the common man century. But in the corridors of power, a different conversation was taking place. According to diplomatic cables archived at the Truman Library, advisors were already warning the new president about Wallace's unrealistic views on Soviet cooperation. Secretary of State James Burns, who harbored his own disappointment at not receiving the vice presidential nomination in 1944, became one of Wallace's most vocal opponents within the administration. Burns had attended the Yalta Conference with Roosevelt and considered himself far more experienced in international affairs than either Truman or Wallace. He viewed Wallace's advocacy for continuing Roosevelt's policy of accommodation with Stalin as dangerously naive, perhaps even treasonous. The initial months of Truman's presidency revealed a man struggling to find his footing while simultaneously being pulled toward a harder line against the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton. Missouri, in March of 1946, with Truman sitting prominently on stage. The British Prime Minister's warning that Soviet expansion threatened all of Europe resonated with Truman's advisors, who had been pushing this interpretation of Stalin's intentions for months. Wallace watched these developments with growing alarm. From his position at Commerce, he continued advocating for Roosevelt's vision of big power cooperation, arguing that confrontation would inevitably lead to another catastrophic war. He pointed to Soviet losses during World War II, over 27 million dead, as evidence that Stalin wanted security, not conquest. Wallace proposed massive American loans to help Soviet reconstruction, believing economic interdependence would prevent future conflict. But Wallace's arguments found less and less receptive ears in the White House. Truman's worldview was shaped by advisors like Burns, Fleet Admiral William Leahy, and Averell Harriman, the ambassador to Moscow who had soured on Soviet cooperation. These men brought Truman reports of Soviet repression in Eastern Europe, broken promises about Polish elections, and aggressive rhetoric from Soviet leadership. Each briefing pushed Truman further from Roosevelt's accommodation policy and closer to confrontation. The ideological gulf between Truman and Wallace widened with each passing week. Truman saw Stalin as a ruthless dictator who understood only strength and whose word could not be trusted. Wallace saw Stalin as a paranoid leader whose brutal methods were regrettable, but whose security concerns were legitimate and needed to be addressed through diplomacy. These were not differences that could be bridged through compromise. They represented fundamentally incompatible visions of America's role in the post-war world. By the summer of 1946, Wallace had become increasingly isolated within the administration. Cabinet meetings became tense affairs where his arguments for continued cooperation with Moscow were met with barely concealed hostility. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who would become one of the Cold War's most ardent architects, considered Wallace a Soviet sympathizer whose influence needed to be eliminated. The question was no longer whether Wallace would remain in the cabinet, but when and how Truman would move against him. The trigger for the final confrontation was approaching rapidly, set in motion by Wallace's determination to speak the truth as he saw it, regardless of political consequences. His loyalty was to Roosevelt's vision and to preventing another war, not to Harry Truman's administration. That loyalty would cost him everything. September 12, 1946, Henry Wallace stood backstage at Madison Square Garden in New York City, reviewing the speech that would end his political career. Outside, 20,000 people packed the arena for a rally organized by the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences and Professions and the National Citizens Political Action Committee, progressive organizations that still believed in Wallace's vision of peace. The Commerce Secretary knew his words would provoke controversy, but he believed silence in the face of escalating Cold War rhetoric would be far more dangerous. The speech Wallace prepared directly challenged the Truman administration's increasingly confrontational policy toward the Soviet Union. He had submitted the text to Truman days earlier, and the president had allegedly approved it, though this claim would later become bitterly disputed. Wallace planned to argue that American policy was driving Stalin toward greater defensiveness, that the United States had no more business intervening in Eastern Europe than the Soviet Union had intervening in Latin America, and that the path to peace required mutual respect for spheres of influence. When Wallace took the podium that September evening, his voice carried the conviction of a man who believed he was fighting to prevent World War III. "The tougher we get with Russia, the tougher they will get with us," he declared, his words amplified through speakers to the enthusiastic crowd. He criticized what he called military-minded advisors, who were pushing America toward confrontation. He argued that American loans and trade could moderate Soviet behavior far more effectively than military threats and atomic diplomacy. The audience erupted in applause, standing ovations punctuating Wallace's most pointed criticisms of administration policy. But even as New Yorkers cheered, fury was building in Washington, Paris, and London. Secretary of State Burns was in Paris attending a crucial conference on post-war European settlement when news of Wallace's speech arrived. According to State Department records housed in the National Archives, Burns immediately fired off an angry cable to Truman, essentially demanding that the president choose between his Secretary of State and his Commerce Secretary. The international reaction was swift and damaging. European allies who were nervously watching Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe saw Wallace's speech as evidence of dangerous division within American leadership. Did the United States stand firmly against Soviet aggression, or was Wallace's accommodationist position the true American policy? Soviet propagandists gleefully seized on Wallace's words as proof that reasonable Americans understood Stalin's legitimate security concerns. Republican opposition leaders attacked immediately, with Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who had been cooperating with Truman on foreign policy, declaring that bipartisan unity was impossible if the administration spoke with two voices on fundamental questions of war and peace. The political pressure on Truman became intense and immediate. Conservative Democrats joined Republicans in demanding Wallace's removal, arguing that his continued presence in the cabinet was undermining American credibility at a critical moment. Truman initially tried to defuse the crisis through semantic gymnastics, claiming that he had approved Wallace giving the speech but not the specific policy positions within it, a distinction that convinced no one and made the president appear weak and confused. The firestorm only intensified. Within days, it became clear that Truman would have to make a choice, and everyone in Washington knew which way that choice would go. Wallace remained defiant, convinced that he was fighting for Roosevelt's true legacy against men who were betraying it. He refused to recant or apologize, even as allies urged him to find some compromise that might save his position. His stubbornness reflected both his profound conviction and his political naivete. Wallace believed that ideas and principles should triumph over expedience, that speaking truth to power was a duty that transcended personal ambition. It was a noble philosophy that was about to collide catastrophically with the realities of Washington politics. The countdown to Wallace's firing had accelerated dramatically. Within days, his long government career would be over, and his transformation from establishment insider to radical outsider would be complete. September 20th, 1946, 8 days after the Madison Square Garden speech, Henry Wallace received a terse letter from President Truman requesting his resignation as Secretary of Commerce. The message was brief, formal, and final. "It is with the most extreme regret that I accept your resignation," Truman wrote, though the sentiment rang hollow given the circumstances. Wallace's 17-year career in government, spanning two of the most transformative presidencies in American history, ended not with honor or ceremony but with what amounted to a political execution. The week between the speech and the dismissal had been chaotic. Wallace had attempted to continue his public advocacy, giving interviews where he doubled down on his critique of Truman's foreign policy. He argued that America was abandoning Roosevelt's vision of big power cooperation in favor of a dangerous policy of atomic monopoly and military intimidation. Each statement drove the wedge deeper, making his continued presence in the cabinet increasingly untenable. Truman faced a genuine crisis. Burns had effectively threatened to resign if Wallace remained, and losing his Secretary of State in the middle of crucial European negotiations would have been catastrophic. Congressional Democrats were in open revolt, with conservative Southern senators demanding Wallace's head. Even some of Wallace's traditional allies in the labor movement urged him to resign quietly rather than tear the Democratic Party apart months before crucial midterm elections.